Okay, we're live in 5 seconds. All right. Thank you everyone for your time today. We're live. So good evening to our audience here in Asia, and good morning to our audience in Europe and from around the world. My name is Rohan Ramkrishnan, and I'll be your moderator for this session, which is brought to you by the World Economic Forum's Sustainable Development Investment Partnership, together with ASEAN Post here at the Davos Agenda Week. Finance is the tipping point for ASEAN sustainable development, and that's our topic for today. And to help us navigate this exciting area is a fantastic panel. We have with us here today Her Excellency Chia Sarai, Assistant Governor and Director General at the National Bank of Cambodia, here with us from Phnom Penh. We've got Mr. Gilbert Fosan Hongwa, President of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, all the way from Rome. And we've also got Mr. Rino Donoso Puerto, Vice Chairman for ASEAN and President Commissioner from Indonesia, from Standard Chartered. Before we begin, let me give you a little bit of a background on what's developing around this region. ASEAN is the fastest growing region in the world. It is home to the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the centerpiece for China's Belt and Road Initiative. With a unique population close to 700 million people, Southeast Asia is a cauldron of cultures and a melting point of diversity. More recently, in November 2020, it became the masterpiece for the world's largest trading pact, involving China, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. The RCEP will cover 47.4% of the world's population, 1/3 of global GDP, 29% of world trade, and approximately 32% of global investment. This on a whole represents the profound eastward shift of the global center of economic gravity from west to east, and the growing geostrategic importance of ASEAN as an emerging market. As the world continues to deal with the impact of climate change, poverty, and now COVID-19, progress towards the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals is at risk. Global sustainable investment is gathering pace, but the vast majority isn't targeted where it's most needed, here in the emerging markets in Southeast Asia and ASEAN. A recent report by Standard Chartered, titled The $50 Trillion Question, looked at how to close the sustainable development investment gap. Through a survey of the world's top 300 asset management companies, with assets of close to USD 50 trillion, half of global GDP, they found that emerging markets are seeing a shortfall in investment. 2/3 of this assets under management is in developed markets. They also found that in reality, investors can achieve returns and create impact simultaneously by closing the emerging markets and sustainable development goals investment gap in this region, given that the survey found that their investments either matched or outperformed developed market investments. More importantly, there is a profound shift towards sustainable investment with a more integrated approach to ESGs. COVID-19, however, has further widened the capital gap between emerging and developed markets. Fiscal capacity is now reduced. There's higher resilience on private sector financing to support this sustainable development. Thus, this session will explore how the finance sector can create a tipping point for ASEAN sustainable development, bringing innovation, increasing awareness, and finding new partnerships. To kick off, let's get a short brief from each of our speakers, and let's find out from them, what are their views on this new reality for financing sustainable development dictated by COVID-19. Let's kick off with Her Excellency Chia Sarai from the National Bank of Cambodia. Would you like to kick off?
Yeah, sure, Rohan. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those in other part of the world, Europe. I watched at the beginning of the week when Klaus Schwab was making his inaugural speech, and he mentions that the whole week sessions or forum is meant for people with heart and not just head. So with that in mind, I will be speaking a lot from the heart and may not be as a central banker at all. Okay, so in every single forum that I've been to, we talk about SDG, we talk about climate change, we talk about social equities, etc. And yet they're very slow progress. It's as if, over the past 10 years, it's the same topic, and you wonder whether, there's actually been done about this. Of course, I don't deny that there are progress, but it's not fast enough. And I see COVID-19 perhaps as a blessing in disguise that really forced us to reevaluate our priorities as individuals with all the lockdowns, etc., as a nation, as a region, and as humanity. And so, facing with a natural calamity like this time is pandemic, we are really powerless, and God knows, next time calamity, what it will be. It could be another tsunami, it could be, a storm or anything. So that's remind me really of the famous line from Game of Thrones, "Winters is coming," where we really need to put our differences aside and come together within the border, but as well as across the border to try to solve this problem. And to achieve that, I think we need more than just financial incentive. And of course, we are going to talk about financial incentive in these sessions, but I think that we need more than that. We need to trigger the human conscience as human being and as citizen of the world. But money matters, as we all know. So we are definitely going to discuss about this in detail. We need to think of ways that we can bring together there's the concept of blended finance. I don't know if you've heard about this. Is a good example of how different industries, different sector can come together and achieve this common goal, which is the SDG. Domestically in Cambodia, it's very interesting that the private sector, the Bankers Association, in fact, come up with their own initiative called the Cambodian Financial Sustainable Finance Initiative. Of course, with support from the central bank as well as our Ministry of Environment, but it kind of sort of plays me in a way that the private sector should come up with their own initiative rather than having the government forcing it down on them. But then I also realized that all this has a financial incentive behind, because if our banks or associations adopt the principle that they set out to do, then it's make them easier to access international funding. So then it's an interesting concept. So we have the principle in place. We're training the people now, and we can't really assess, the success of it yet. But I think it's a very good beginning.
Okay, thank you so much, Your Excellency. I've taken down some points on those. So we'll come back to that later. Bapak Doni, over to you. Could you tell us what are your thoughts on how we could accelerate, how we could reset and look at things more differently? What's the new reality?
Thank you, Rohan, and interesting to hear from Her Excellency about the reference to the Game of Thrones. Indeed, actually, winter is coming, as President Jokowi had mentioned also a few years back. So, but Rohan, very quickly, actually, no doubt, last year was a year of reckoning, where we saw the global widespread of COVID that led to one of the worst global economic crises in modern times, and really changed the way we live our lives. Now, we know that climate change and sustainability-related issues have been clear and present danger that we have been facing even pre-COVID. Now, on reflection, I think COVID-19 has actually indeed put a spotlight on sustainability as we learn the hard way of the impacts of changes in climate and nature to our lives. We entered 2021, we heard a lot of economists and global leaders talking about the road to recovery from the pandemic. But you see actually that it's not just about a monoline economic recovery. We see that the world is now looking at how to recover better, incorporating sustainability in building a post-COVID world, where here capital and financing play a very important part in the efforts to address these issues. And whilst it isn't nearly enough, I think we talk about, you mentioned SDG investment essentially is still trillions of dollars short of the capital needed to be the 2030 target. there has been an encouraging pace of innovations in sustainable development goal financing that we've seen. Sustainably linked loans, blue and green bonds, voluntary carbon markets, transition finance, and many more. I'm sure actually we'll discuss a little bit more actually in detail. You touch upon the $50 trillion questions. Let me quickly actually sort of share with you. I mean, essentially, as Standard Chartered, sustainability is one of our top priority agenda, as has the vision to be the world's most sustainable and responsible bank. So we started a journey about 20 years ago, embedding core values into the culture, develop frameworks and tools to implement those principles, and setting targets and commitments to ourselves to promote sustainable development in the markets that we operate. Now, this study that we did, 50 trillion question, essentially we spoke to around 300 asset managers with a combined AUM, asset under management, of 50 trillion. That's equivalent to more than half of global GDP. In search of the answers in relation to SDG financing. Now, very interesting insights. You share some of it. Actually, some may seem paradoxical, but let me just give you quick highlights. So, global investor, as you rightly say, generally underinvested in emerging markets. At least 2/3 of their AUM currently invested in developed markets. They cited risk in emerging market investment, both whether financial, economic, and political, as the barriers, if you will. On the other hand, the research also reveals that 88% investors have seen their emerging market investment match or outperform those in developed markets. So that's the key here. Now, almost 3/4 of investors, about 70%, believe that the pandemic has indeed widened the gap between emerging and developed markets, which is very concerning because if the crisis is causing emerging market investment to fall, progress can be hampered towards promoting SDGs. So what we think is that COVID-19 has made the imperative for all of the key stakeholders, particularly emerging markets, to act even stronger. Now, the positive side, though, almost 3/4 of the investors, about 74%, say that a green recovery, which is cutting CO2 emissions as part of a Build Back Better approach, is now a global priority. And sustainable investment is gathering pace. More than 80% of the investment firms have moved beyond screening to a more focused and integrated approach to environmental, social, and governance investments. So increasingly, investors are considering ESG issues when making decisions. And trillions of dollars are expected to flow into ESG funds over the next 3 years. So this is actually where the opportunities lies. Now, I'm just going to quote actually in terms of market opportunities, ASEAN, according to IFC report, actually we'll need about 3 trillion of green investments until 2030, or 200 billion annually. And that survey that we did as a last point also highlighted that this 300 investment funds, asset managers, 39% of them think actually that ASEAN will be the area of focus for the next 3 years. This is actually the largest by far, that they will set to increase investment in this region. So for us, in ASEAN, opportunities are ample. It's really actually stars are sort of aligning, if you will, actually, but obviously it's down to all the stakeholders actually to make it happen. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Gilbert, over to you. From the IFAD, right? What are your views? What are your views on this? You've heard the case from Her Excellency. You've heard from Donnie. Well, what is the new reality for financing sustainable development? What's a resilient approach to take? Gilbert, if you
thank you
just
so much, Rohan, and thank you for having us this morning here, this afternoon, your time.
Yes, thank you.
I just want to compliment what my two colleagues were saying, which I totally agree with. I will start by saying whatever we're saying here is with the assumption that from the health perspective, the pandemic will be soon under control. On that. If the situation is to worsen, which none of us is hoping for, it could even be create a different dynamic than what we are discussing on today. So we really need to keep in mind also the health dimension of the issue. On the pure finance side, my biggest concern today is the aftermath of the pandemic might contribute to widen the gap between the have and the have-nots. We know the consequence that COVID has had, particularly on those part of the population that are living on a daily income basis. And we will have to be quite very mindful that the financial solution, the innovation we're putting, looking forward, we do not limit ourselves just to the macro approach. That we insist in making sure that the solutions are really keeping the inclusiveness dimension, to make sure that at the end of the day, we have to keep in mind in many parts of Asia and elsewhere, 80% of the poor live in rural area.
That's right.
And some of the solutions that we know countries are putting in place to fight against the socio-economic impacts have maybe done good globally at the national level, but not necessarily where the poor are concentrated, which is one. Just as we see on the health side, the risk of the richest will have the vaccine, the poorest may not have it on time. The same divide could happen on the financing side. That's what IFAD is really standing against, trying to draw everybody attention to make sure that we bring everybody together. I remember, I have the president of the Asia Farmers Association calling me last year in March or April. Then all of a sudden, overnight, the production were on a standstill, cannot even get to the local market. So we're not even talking about the international market to be able to get the finance there. And a lot of those poor community have started selling their meager assets to survive, the meager asset that they use for the production to survive. So it's going to be important we start doing that to a certain degree to help them stop selling their assets. So in Bangladesh, there has been a good example, for example, where the government, working with the government, we have been able to advance resources to help paying the monthly installment to the microcredit institution, so to avoid the sale of their asset, for example. So that dimension, it seems to me, is going to be critical. The other point, and I will just maybe stop there, and I believe Her Excellency Shia Seri touched on that. When we will be moving forward, although the famous 50 trillion are there, the cooperation, the international cooperation, the way forward is going to be essential.
Yes, the multi-stakeholder.
On that. And obviously, ASEAN or Asia in general is very well placed given how vibrant the economy is. Over.
Thank you for that, Gilbert. I'm giving that point of view. Very interesting. The food security issue. We'll come back to that. I'm just going to touch on what you mentioned earlier about innovation and how innovation can actually help fuel reaching or bridging the gap in reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, the Agenda Week has talked about here at the WEF a lot about the global reset, right? And of course, I think status quo prior to COVID. I don't think personally, but then I think a lot of people share this view. It is not going to work. So we need to innovate. We need to innovate to bridge this gap. We need to innovate to make sure we have a very resilient recovery, and also at the same time ensuring there's sufficient capital investment available, right? Also fiscally and also from the private sector as well. Your Excellency, Chasarai, maybe you could tell us some similar examples of what's working in Cambodia within any sector that you think has the most impactful innovation, and how it could be replicated across the region, across ASEAN, as a Cambodian example.
Yeah, I mean, I will have to refer and agree to what Mr. Gilbert mentions about, when we talk about SDG financing, we don't just talk about the big financing, big project financing. We should also look at the small financing that is needed. And Through the course of my career, I've been working a lot on access to finance. And we know that, during this COVID, particularly Cambodia, when we're relying on tourism and agriculture sector, when tourists don't come, a lot of our agricultural produce are unused. And then at the same time, there's a gap for the domestic consumers to be able to access to those excess supply. So there is these logistical issues. And I've tried to work with a few e-commerce players. As we all know, e-commerce come about. And try to help not just on the financing, but everything together. And this is where innovation comes from. As part of this COVID, you see a lot of e-commerce platform coming up, right? And then they're all scattered and there is no synergies. So what I'm trying to work, and this is really from a personal initiative. And again, as I said, sometimes you have to assess individually what you can do. You can't always...
The human factor.
And I explained to my colleague that this is not probably central banking, but I have my central banking background and experiences, and I want to help. So basically try to bring this e-commerce platform together and create sort of a single application of what's going on. And so what happened is you expand the market access of each individual player. So when you merge together, if let's say I am application A, I have 100,000 downloads. Now that I merge with a few others, now I have million users. So I expand the market base. I'm also able to understand better in terms of the flow of the produce, what is more consumed in the market, should I go back and tell my farmers? So let's say if, salad, which is lettuce, which is more consumed by tourists than the local, if it's not consumed now, there's no point for them to continue doing it. So let's just focus on lemongrass or lime or something that the local are using. So data would help a lot. At the same time, if everything happened in this platform, financial institution will be able to understand the cash flow of these farmers. You'll be able to synergize the logistic of this different platform as well. So instead of me ordering from platform A and the delivery go to my house, and if I go to platform B, there's another delivery guys, I can now combine the delivery together and look at the amount of carbon emissions that you save, look at the money that you save, and look at the information that you have. So this is something that I'm trying to work now at an individual level, but also as an institutional level, we continue to focus on financial inclusion because that is what we know best. And so we work with different players in how to help the lower segment of the markets, the farmers in particular, and the women entrepreneurs to be able to better use that, not to just access, but know how to use their finances.
Right. And that's brilliant. Going over to you, Johnny, just following on from what Her Excellency said, right? Just a lot of stuff about data, digitalization, basically the whole works around the fourth industrial revolution, how it's totally disrupting things, and some brilliant examples from Her Excellency. What about in the case of Indonesia? I mean, is there any examples that you think can be scaled up and replicated across the region? Indonesia is massive. It's a $1 trillion economy. It's one of the main drivers of the ASEAN economic community. What are your thoughts on that, Papadoni?
Well, Rohan, very similar actually to what Her Excellency has shared. Certainly, digitalization has played a massive part in transforming the whole market. And with regards to SDG goals, we can see that how digitalization, all the e-commerce platforms, Indonesia actually has got a fair share of its own unicorns here, whether they're e-commerce, fintech, and others, the likes of Gojek, for example, which is quite unique. Now, this has enabled a very clear direct empowerment to the marginal sectors. The unbanked, the regulatory side from Indonesia actually has sort of pushed further actually to use this or leverage actually on this to reach out to the unbanked sectors, certain sort of more marginalized sort of, and Indonesia is a big archipelago. It's not easy to reach it actually to the normal brick and mortar financing activities, whether for the private sector or for the government. So clearly, no doubt, I think actually there's enough stories actually coming up as to how Indonesia is promoting SDGs, particularly on the
Yes.
social side of things, actually through the use of digital platforms. I suppose, but perhaps actually, I'm more interested actually on maybe actually I can give a perspective a little bit about innovation that relates directly actually to climate change sort of side of things.
Nice. Yeah.
I think first of all, just to share with everybody that notwithstanding that we still need many more trillions actually to come in to meet SDG goals by 2030, sustainable finance has experienced incredible growth actually the last few years. So just the data from 2019, it reached 465 billion of sustainable finance activity, up 78% from the previous year. If you normalize it actually for 2020, based on the year to date, actually it says actually for another 40 and 50% at least another growth. Now, predominantly though, actually this close to $500 billion of sustainable finance are largely dominated by bonds, in particular green bonds. Green bonds alone issuance actually is more than this 465 billion. So the DCM or debt capital market sort of side seems to be taking a lot of tractions, and you see a variety of different kinds of bonds happening. Now, moving forward, what we think actually is really quite important from the innovation side of things is to essentially optimize on the scaling up of voluntary carbon markets, because that would provide the intermediaries actually from the developing developed markets actually into the developing markets. And a global CEO, a group CEO, Bill Winters, is leading a global task force on voluntary carbon markets. And I'm sure actually they will be reporting, if I'm not mistaken, to this WEF Davos Week session as well. But that carbon markets is something actually that it's not new. It didn't quite work so well in the past because of lack of standardizations, registrations, and so on. However, it has emerged to be one of the key sort of trends going out. And countries in ASEAN has significant natural capital, as we discussed earlier, in order to leverage and maximize this opportunity that's coming up.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for that. Just again, leading on from what you just mentioned, right? Gilbert, over at IFAD, right, from a global level down to an ASEAN level, right? If we talk about climate change or issues like, for example, transboundary haze, land management, deforestation, you even touched on food security earlier. How do you see, one, digitalization playing a part? Two, how do you see accelerating sustainability across this entire supply chain, accelerating of course, number one, the SDGs, and number two, of course, adoption, right? Sorry, not adoption, more of recovery in the post-COVID era. How do you see this happen?
Let me come in maybe on three key aspects that I see it. First of all, from a global public-private finance. Secondly, from the sustainability dimension, as well as the innovation that you mentioned. From a global finance perspective, is important. I mean, I should have prefaced, but everything we are doing which for me is quite interesting. Nothing is really new. Most of it, I think, that were already in the pipeline or happening that we need to ramp up. We have to keep that in mind. So that being said, I think it's going to be important for us to have the director of Central Bank of Cambodia, Sore, was referring to it at the beginning, the blend financing. So it's going to be important for us to bring in the public finance, blended with the private finance, with the idea of helping de-risking the investment, so to create much more investment appetite for the private sector, so we can tap much more on our famous 50 trillion. 50 trillion, so that for me is going to be essential moving forward, that we find ways to step it up. So it will be good to hear from Rino on this. You will see that there are more and more predisposition of the private sector to not in terms of just in terms of corporate social responsibility, but in terms of social investment, money making, and at the same time helping addressing the post-COVID impact, which is one. Secondly, for the sustainability, one thing that I keep, 2 weeks ago, I was in the One Planet Summit in Paris, and one point that we keep making is that you might recall a year ago, or last year or 2 years ago, I don't recall, in Davos, at the very time, Bill Gates and the former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, presented the result of the commission that they were leading on climate change adaptation. And you will see that when you go through those reports, you will see that essentially why there's more and more investment in the global climate change environment dimension, which is a positive, but only 15% goes to adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
And within that 15%, you barely have 4 or 5 points that will go to our rural setting. Mm-hmm. So what is going to be crucial if our producers, we do not bring them in a new technique, innovate. So for me, the financial innovation is also linked to also innovation in the production, innovation in the transformation, so that the producers also can increase their carbon sequestration, the land management, the water harvesting. And more importantly, in our domain, in agriculture, we know that at least 70% of fresh water is used for agriculture. So innovation, by being able to use the optimal level of water, is going to be crucial and linked to finance.
Right.
Then my last point is that we got to put all of that together.
Yeah.
The SDG themselves, even before COVID, they were already quite daunting in terms of the challenge. And we know we were already running late in several of the SDGs. So now it could get worse. The World Bank made it clear more than 132 million people are going backward in terms of poverty line. So we really need to put our effort together, the different stakeholders, to make sure that there is a much more synergy. And that in several domains. In our case, the Secretary General of the UN has called for this food system summit.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're trying to achieve.
Right. So basically, what you're talking about over here would be a multi-stakeholder approach, right? Leveraging on the value of strategic partnerships. Just coming to you, Excellency, what are your views on that? What are your views on what Gilbert has just said on a regional perspective?
I understand that under the ASEAN finance minister and central bank governor framework, there's been studies on the sustainable development financing, and different organizations. Well, I mean, the Ministry of Finance are trying to come up with best practices and, of course, rules and definitions of what we define as green. So we want to do this collectively as a region. So this is in terms of collaboration among government agencies. In terms of the multi-stakeholders approach, in Cambodia, there's an interesting sort of happenings now where I mentioned to you earlier about the banks coming up with their own principle, Sustainable Finance Initiative. And currently there is an effort to design a green investment vehicle with the support of the Green Climate Fund and the USAID. Again, the Green Finance, the Green Climate Fund will provide funding. The USAID will provide the necessary sort of capacity building and consultation to put it in place. And the banks would benefit from that in the sense that if they agree to the principle, So we have almost all the banks are members to this initiative. If you are a member of this initiative, first USAID and a couple of other AFD, the Asian Development, the French Agency for Development, would also help build capacity of the financial sector staff in terms of credit underwriting, trying to assess what are the risks. And then once you do all this, the Green Climate Fund will be able to then fund the bank at a concessional rate. And this is a very good example of a multi-stakeholder approach to
very
this.
Practical approach.
Yeah, and it's too early to say, whether it is successful, but so far this is a model that has been attracting a lot of interest from the region as well. The other things I wanted to mention as well, in terms of trying to bring all these bigger fund. Just now I mentioned about, we shouldn't just focus on the bigger money, but we should also, but the bigger money is important. And I wanted to mention also here is that first, the role of the central bank is very important, of the regulator. I'm not trying to minimize the role of other agencies, but the role of the regulators are very important. And where we are trying to play here with our private sector is a supporting role rather than imposing. And it's very important because if we were to set rules and regulations.
Have we lost you there?
Is green? What is the implication of certain investment? I am not skilled into that. And so there are challenges that the local players should come up with local solutions. And a very simple example in terms of financing hydropower, for instance, I mean, it's safer alternative to, fossil fuel. It's supposed to be great, but then at the same time is, a lot of the population are relying on fishing along the rivers, and they're displaced of that because of that. Then it's a different challenges altogether for that particular country. So we need the private sector to come up with that kind of solution. What are the incentives that they need to make it happen? And we as a regulator, we work and we support. So this is the role of the central bank. The other point that I wanted to mention is, when we were talking about big investment, a lot of the time the central bank, when we talk about blended finance, right? We talk about government, public fund, philanthropic fund, and private fund. Central banks, we're somewhere, in a gray area. We need the public, we need a philanthropic, and we need the private. But we do have a large amount of foreign exchange reserve that we manage. And every central bank, particularly in emerging economy in this region, central banks are able to accumulate a lot of foreign exchange reserve. And what is interesting is that the Central Bank of Cambodia, National Bank of Cambodia, for instance, we do invest. So we have in our investment guidelines that we should invest something that is would contribute positively to SDG. The wording is a bit more complicated. But, when we buy green bond issued by the German government or green bond issued by the BIS, for instance, this is our contribution to them. But those bonds, the fund that receive is not necessarily reinvest back into our region.
That's right.
And so how do we try to solve this? Understandably, there are, elements of liquidities and safety because you have to manage financial stability. But if your whole financial stability relies, if your financial stability would rely on the fact that people get proper education or people get proper sanitation or clean water, can we change our KPI on that? And of course, this is something that no single central bank or no single nation can address. I think organizations such as the IMF or the BIS could come up with something that, for the purpose of managing your financial stability, you need liquidity But then at the same time, if you're able to contribute positively to climate change or SDGs, or climate change is in SDG, then this is what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to allocate additional loans or whatever, margins to the banks that are putting effort towards that goal. So I hope that will be something that we can discuss further in this discussion.
Sure. I mean, Johnny, what are your views on that? I mean, Standard Chartered is a massive bank, it's a behemoth. You have a huge DCM, debt capital market unit. You're very used to mobilizing large pools of capital. Do you think that a lot of that money can be channeled back to this region, right, and help to accelerate the capital gap?
Well, Rohan, certainly. I mean, we got unique presence in ASEAN. We talk about ASEAN. It's the only bank actually with 10 present in all the 10 markets. And I suppose now let's go back actually to the study that we did on the 50 trillion. It's very clear that some of the risks we all talk about, that predominantly AUM is still invested 2/3 actually in the developed markets and so on and so forth. So what does it take, as Her Excellency mentioned, to attract those funds coming in? Let's look at some of the reasons as to why the asset managers are sort of putting a lot of their investments actually in the developed markets. A couple of things: structural issues.
Okay.
Again, some of these actually are perceptions because there's a big piece of overlay actually that we put into this, right? So structural issues around property rights, legal certainty, institutional strengths, general market transparency have been called out as blockers on the flow of capital into some emerging markets. There's also actually other issues relating to market volatility, bribery, corruption risk, government interference in business, and political risk. Now, I suppose very important. We believe actually as this is our quasi home market, if you will, in ASEAN, that many of these actually means perception. So it has to be really properly addressed by communication, engagement with these investors, that this risk, and if at all, actually, this COVID shows us actually risk happens everywhere in the world right now. It's not located actually in the developing markets, right? But also demonstrate actually a number of things actually that have been progressed from a framework perspective, governance perspective, leveling the playing field, adopting international best practice as standards for ESGs, very, very critical. To Her Excellency's point, regulator plays a very important part.
At policy level, right?
That's right. I mean, from a banking side, I suppose actually many of the banks, global banks, would like to see a level playing field across all of the markets, whether it's developed or developing. So that actually it is creating a fair competition, actually, amongst others, and also help to attract more capital and investments into developing markets such as ASEAN.
You're right. Thank you for that, Donnie. And Gilbert, is that your view as well, that it's a combination of regulatory policy perception on a global and also at a regional level that needs to be tackled? Could you give some practical examples? I know we're almost done with our session, but just before we conclude, I'd love to stretch it longer. But just for a takeaway, right? Can we have some practical actions that you would really, really like to see take place in the next 12 months to accelerate all these gaps that we're talking about in SDGs, and also in terms of fueling more investment? What sort of practical actions do you think would help accelerate the impacts of meeting these goals?
Thank you so much. Some practical action, to me, yes, I agree with you that is a combination of the different dimension of it. First of all, the regulatory, a lot of countries, globally speaking, and also in ASEAN as well, we still have a lot to do in terms of the regulatory framework and the policy reform to make sure that you create the environment that will be conducive for attracting those financing. So which is one. Secondly, for me, what is fascinating, and again, going back to the central bank, the consortium and the fact that the ASEAN Minister of Finance Central Banker meet regularly and very active group is an asset on which we should lean on. It will be, we know how much G7 or equivalent countries have been able to inject in their economy after the post. So how in ASEAN or elsewhere in the world can we also have similar leverage? Yeah. So it can only happen when all the central banks in ASEAN are working together. For me, that's practically something that I would really like to see happen.
Regional cooperation, unified.
Exactly. And it's true that you need to balance that with your debt management, of course, on that. The third dimension that I cannot insist enough is bringing the private sector into play. Bringing the private sector into play. That's where, again, when I was referred to as maybe public finance serving as a de-risking, will help attracting much more those funds. And finally, keeping an eyes on the financial inclusion dimension.
Financial inclusion. Your Excellency, what are your thoughts? Having frameworks, you're a policymaker, very senior policymaker, frameworks, more conducive environment, active working groups, more unified cooperation. Don't you think there's already a lot of that?
That's the problem, is the implementation. So we can have a lot of framework in place, we can have a lot of discussions, forum after forum, we can talk about it, but we need actions. And that's why I mentioned earlier, I did this sort of trying to bring different e-commerce platforms on a personal initiative, because I really love to see that it works. So sometimes, it's because if we were to, fully rely on, the taxonomy of greens or whatever, it would never going to end. So you have to be very practical and pragmatic in your approach in implementing whatever you can do best, personally, regionally, or as a company, you should do. And I, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that you need to trigger the human conscience in us to do this. You can't always wait for incentive, financial incentive. What really frustrates me is, every time you talk to the private sector, there's always, but my shareholders want this. And I say, well, this is just to go to your shareholders. What about the rest of us? What do we get from that? So this is really, really important. And I don't think there is no, bullet solutions that we can, solve this overnight. What we can hope and pray is that everyone will come to their own conscience and do this.
The human factor you mentioned.
Yes, but of course the frameworks and etc. do help a lot and to move quicker.
Thank you for that, Your Excellency. Bapak Doni, frameworks, conducive environments, active working groups, and all the other things that we hear from Gilbert as a multilateral organization, from Her Excellency Chasaray as a policymaker, as central banker. I want to hear it from you. You're a titan of investment banker. You've done some massive deals. Bankers are pretty much pragmatic. You get the deal done. What would you think is an extremely practical solution to all of this?
Well, I don't know whether there is any simple practical solutions, but there are certainly actually ways that we should be working on in order to capture these opportunities. Again, as I mentioned earlier, sitting in ASEAN, we are really actually at a prime spot actually, and there are ample opportunities like that we need to obtain. But can I just very quickly actually address, because this is one of that practical
solutions, please.
To the point actually that Her Excellency made about shareholders. So what about the shareholders? What about the others? It's actually very important to communicate, educate, and even promote further. And we've seen a very encouraging educational, to private investors, individual clients, about the need to not just get better return, but also beyond that. So it is actually that make actually that investment meaningful. So I think it's happening, Her Excellency, in that sense. Of course, actually a lot more effort has to be done, and you're absolutely right, spot on, because without unlocking actually that, without sort of changing that mindset there, that would hamper actually corporations actually to move into the right way in supporting the SDGs. The other point actually that made by Gilbert about whether banks not teaching the SDGs, I think actually we are way beyond that. Really, actually, this is at the core of many of company strategy, such as ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, maybe actually the other two key points actually that I just would like to highlight actually for us, all the stakeholders in ASEAN. One is to ensure that we capture, we're pretty sort of savvy in capturing the trends actually that's happening right now and creating all of the infrastructure ecosystem, including governance frameworks and so on, that would be conducive to capture all of that. Carbon transition will continue to be a hot topic in 2021. World is realizing that to achieve a net zero carbon world by 2050, action needs to be taken quite urgently. So China actually has announced its carbon neutrality, US is going to follow suit this year and so on. So the other thing is about the carbon markets that I touched upon earlier. Again, this is really vital because ASEAN actually has abundance of natural capital.
Yes.
Supporting actually and having a local framework for carbon trading is so important to be adopted by each of the ASEAN countries and standardizations to ensure that it is prime actually when it enters into the global carbon trading market. Last but not least is, I think, actually circular economy. There's a lot of talks actually about reducing waste, the concept of reducing, recycling, reusing, very core concept. Again, governments actually can help by putting policies that really, really support this. That would bode well actually with the global investors. I suppose actually these are the types of things actually that we must do. And last but not least, it's all hands on deck. There's no one party actually who can do this. I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
And sessions such as this, I suppose, actually will help in garnering that support from private sectors, multilaterals, governments in this part of the world.
Thank you so much for that. Well, finance is the tipping point for ASEAN sustainable development. Those are our talking points from today's session. We've heard some very, very insightful views, some very practical. We've also heard some of the pain points in trying to meet these SDGs to bridge the capital investment gap. And before I break off, COVID is something that's sort of totally disrupted our everyday of life. Mr. Gilbert, I would like to ask you, what is the one thing you'd like to see in this world in a post-COVID environment? What would you like to see?
Very simple. What I would like to see is globally we strengthen building the resilience, not only the resilience of our economy, but the resilience of our people, the people centered and building the resilience to shock. Today, the shock is called COVID. Tomorrow, it can be a tsunami. We don't know, but we know we will be facing shocks. So it's building the resilience to shock.
Building resilience. Thank you. Your Excellency, over to you. What is the one thing you'd like to see in this world post-COVID-19?
I hope to see more humanity emerging from this COVID-19.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Bapak Doni, what about you?
I think actually you stole my thunder, Her Excellency. Exactly, actually similar. It's about humanity to stand together, unite, and to care for the world that we live in, essentially.
Thank you so much for that. And with that, thank you for those three lovely, very humanly points on what we would like to see. I share the same view. I also hope to see a more humanistic world after what we've been through. So, ladies and gentlemen, our audience from here in Asia, from across the world, our speakers, Your Excellency, Bapak Doni, Mr. Gilbert, thank you so much for being part of this session. Thank you very much. And we'll sign off now and wishing you a good weekend. And please do stay safe. We live in very challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Rohan.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Better.